the settings. So that should be, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, we can just go to the title.
Yeah, I'm seeing it now.
All right, we've got people coming in. All right, I see everybody joining. We're so happy to have you today. If you guys just want to throw in the chat where you're calling in from, we'd love to see kind of where everybody is based out of. All righty. Well, I just want to say welcome to today's webinar on conducting effective FDA pre-sub meetings, best practices to avoid timely and costly mistakes. I'm Laura Mayer. I'm your moderator, and I'm a medical device guru here at Greenlight Guru. During today's session, we invite you to actively participate, so you're already jumping into the chat. We'll have a few polls, and we also have Q&A over there. So yeah, definitely participate. If you have any questions, that Q&A tab is going to be the best place to ask those, so we can make sure we can get to those towards the end of our session. We will be sending out the full recording and presentation slides to all registrants after this live event, so watch your inbox for that follow-up email. And just a little bit about Greenlight Guru. Our mission is to improve the quality of life through our work in the medtech industry, which is likely a shared goal for many of you on this call today. We like to host these free webinars to share valuable insights, to learn from top industry experts like Mike here, and showcase our industry-leading solutions. Our software is designed to help medtech companies bring life-changing solutions to patients faster, more efficiently, and with less risk. Our MedTech suite includes software solutions for product development, quality management, and clinical data management, and they're all tailored specifically to the medical device industry. So if you want to join our over 1,100 leading MedTech companies that trust us with their QMS and clinical management, then you can do so by visiting greenlight.guru for a personalized demo after today's webinar. So now I'm going to introduce our expert presenter today. We have Michael Drews here, and he is the president of Vascular Sciences, which is a consulting and training company offering a broad range of services to medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotechnology companies, including creative regulatory strategy and competitive regulatory intelligence, regulatory submission design, and FDA presentation, preparation, and defense. Dr. Drews is an internationally recognized expert who brings a breadth of knowledge and hands-on experience in his teachings from ongoing work that he does for the FDA, Health Canada, and other regulatory and governmental agencies around the world. He's also a featured keynote speaker on cutting-edge medical technologies and regulatory affairs. And if you're familiar with our Global Medical Device podcast, you'll definitely recognize him, as he's a very long time, I think he mentioned over 10 years, frequent guest on the show. And I know that many of his podcasts are some that I go to frequently for some great education. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Mike to get started with our presentation.
Thank you, Laura, for that very kind introduction. Can I just quickly confirm you're able to hear me as well as see the screen?
Absolutely. We're good to go.
Great. Thank you. So welcome everybody to this webinar on conducting effective FDA pre-submission meetings, best practices to avoid timely and costly mistakes. As Laura just mentioned, my name is Dr. Michael Drews, but you can call me Mike. She did a good job of giving my background, so I won't reiterate that. The only thing that I do want to add is, in addition to consulting for companies, I also consult for the FDA as well as Health Canada and some of the other regulatory agencies around the world. And the reason why I mentioned that is because that gives me, I don't want to say a unique perspective, but certainly an uncommon perspective, because there's not a lot of people that work on both sides of that fence. And I really try to use that to my advantage. The other thing that I'll just mention quickly about my background is, as Laura mentioned, I do a lot of podcasts and webinars and columns for not just Greenlight Guru, but a number of other organizations as well. So you can find them on this slide by clicking these hyperlinks. By the way, there is a handout that goes along with this webinar that you will be receiving, if not already. So make sure that you get that. And just a couple of other things I wanted to mention, not to be bragging, but I'm proud of this. A couple of months ago, I was named by MDDI Magazine as one of the top 24 MedTech voices to follow in 2024. So I was very pleased to hear about that. And specifically with regard to Greenlight, as Laura mentioned, I've done a number of podcasts. Last year, the top two podcasts, most listened to podcasts in the Greenlight library, if you will, were podcasts of mine. My podcast on artificial intelligence and my podcast on dealing with issues in your 510K submission. And on the webinar side, the webinar that I did last year on complaint handling, how to avoid the number 3 most cited reason for 483 observations, was the number 10 webinar within the Greenlight Guru family. So I've done a lot with Greenlight Guru over the years. I want to thank Laura for moderating this event and thank all of my many friends at Greenlight for the opportunity to conduct this webinar today. Before we begin, just a couple of quick polling questions. And Laura, if you could please turn the polling questions on. These are very quick yes or no kind of questions, just to kind of see where we are as an audience. Are you considering doing a pre-sub with the FDA? Yes or no? That's question number 1. Question number 2 is, have you already had a pre-sub with the FDA? Yes or no? And finally, question number 3, if you've had a pre-sub with the FDA, was it successful? By whatever definition of success you want to use, I'll share with you my definition of a successful pre-sub a little bit later in the webinar. But if you have had a pre-sub already, would you consider it to be successful? So Laura, if you could please open those poll questions, and then we'll just give the audience a few seconds to respond, and then you can please announce the results.
I'm on mute. So can only open one at a time. So we're going to go through, we're on the last question now, but letting a good number of votes come in before going on. But for the first one, are you considering a pre-sub? About 54 people responded yes, and 9 people responded no. So it seems overwhelmingly a lot of people are considering one. In terms of have you already done a pre-sub, it was about half and half. So we had 48 votes for yes and 46 for no. And then if you had a pre-sub with the FDA, was it successful? We had about a little over 50 votes for yes and around 26 votes for no.
Okay, thank you, Laura, for facilitating that, and thank you to those in the audience for answering those questions. That helps me kind of gauge where we are as an audience. And I find the last question to be the most interesting and the most provocative. Was the pre-sub successful? Again, we'll talk about what I think a successful pre-sub is in just a little while. So in terms of the agenda, what I'm hoping to cover today is to tell you as much about the pre-sub process as I can within the time allowed. I'll be honest, I do a lot of pre-subs. I probably do on average about 1 pre-sub per month. So I don't think there's anybody that does more pre-subs than I do. And as I said before, not only do I work with companies, I also work with the FDA. So I also sit on the FDA side of the table from time to time when companies come in to do their pre-subs. I could easily do an entire course just on pre-subs, but we're gonna, we don't have that amount of time, but we're going to cover as much as we can. And, this is sort of a warning, put your seatbelts on, because we're going to be going through this pretty quick. But again, I am going to try as best as I can to save the last 15 minutes or so for some Q&A. And if there's any questions that you have that you don't get a chance to ask during our time together today, or if you're listening to the recording after the fact, you've got my contact information. Please feel free to contact me. I'll be happy to help however I can. And for those of you that don't know me already, let me tell you what my approach is not. And my approach is not to reiterate to you what's in the guidance or what's on FDA's website. I find that insulting. I find that condescending to the audience when people do that. I'm going to be sharing with you well beyond what you're going to read in a guidance or on the FDA's website. If you are interested in more resources on the pre-sub, then just this particular webinar, this slide lists just some of the resources that I put out on the pre-sub process, and you're welcome to read or listen to any of these. Again, these will be in the handout that you get following the webinar. So let's begin with the first question, and that is, what is a pre-submission meeting, also known as a pre-sub, and when should it be used? Well, simply put, a pre-sub is nothing more than a mechanism to communicate with the FDA prior to a submission. A mechanism to communicate with the FDA prior to submission. As we'll talk about in a moment, there are many, many ways that we can communicate with the FDA. The pre-submission is only one of them. The question is it really that simple? For example, what if you're working on a device that involves no submission? What if you're working on a class 1 or perhaps a class 2 exempt device? Can you have a pre-submission meeting for an exempt device? Or what if you're working on a wellness device where, once again, there is no submission? It's almost an oxymoron to ask the question, how do I have a pre-submission or submit a pre-submission request or have a pre-submission meeting if there's not going to be any submission? And if the submission has already occurred, let's say that you already have a device on the market and you want to have some discussion with the FDA about quality or change management or 483s or warning letters or whatever, can we have a pre-submission after the submission, what I call a post-pre-submission meeting, if you will? Bottom line, we do not have formal mechanisms to do any of the things that we just did. Even though the pre-sub process has been around for a long time, there are some very, very significant holes or gaps or omissions. And quite frankly, I'm getting tired of pointing these out to FDA and to AdvaMed and to other organizations because things still haven't really improved much. So I'm just, mentioning that, especially for those in the audience from FDA or other organizations. If you want to have conversations on how we can take the pre-submission process and make it better, I would be happy to do that. Let's take a look at some statistics for pre-submissions. This is as of just a couple of months ago. This was the last publicly available information from the Medufa statistics. There were almost 4,000 pre-submission requests submitted to the FDA last year. The vast majority of them, about over 98% of them, were accepted. A few of them were not accepted. But back to the question that I asked in the polling a moment ago, are most of these pre-subs successful? Just because you submit a pre-sub to the FDA and they accept it and they maybe give you some feedback or having a meeting about it does not, in my book, constitute a successful pre-sub. So the question is, what is a successful pre-sub? My definition of a successful pre-sub is when everyone walks out of the room agreeing with me. When everyone walks out of the room agreeing with me. Now, if we apply that criteria across the board, the vast majority of pre-subs are not successful. It's a simple reality. The vast majority are not successful. So one of the things that I'm going to be sharing, talking a lot about with you today is not just to have a pre-sub, but how do you have a successful pre-sub? And I'll be honest with you, it takes a lot of work. I'll share with you a quick story. After doing a pre-sub, this was before COVID, and so we were actually at the FDA physically. After doing the pre-sub, the ranking member of the company, I think he was the VP of regulatory or something like that, and came up to me and he said, "Mike, we had a great pre-sub. FDA agreed with us on pretty much everything, but let me ask you a question. Do you think we prepared too much? Do you think we spent too much time preparing? Because we did spend a lot of time preparing." And I said, "Gee, that's an interesting question. Let me ask a question in response. If the pre-sub did not go so well, would you have asked the same question?" So it does take a lot of work to prepare for a successful pre-sub. If you want to be average, here's the problem with being average. That means that 50% of the world is better than you are. Or put it another slightly different way, average folks do average things to keep averagely running. This is a very low place to set the bar. I hope all of you in this audience would agree. And just to kind of lighten things up a little bit, let me share with you a short video to illustrate.
Have you ever, Dr. Marcus? Oh yeah, he's okay.
Just okay.
Guess who just got reinstated?
Well, not official. Nervous?
Yeah.
Yeah, me too. Don't worry about it. Yeah. I'll see you in
Just okay. Okay. Especially you are network.
I'm sorry if you heard a little bit of an echo there. I'm not sure, but hopefully you got the gist of it. So, a lot of people tell me that they strive to be compliant, for example, with the regulation. The problem with that is that's the academic equivalent of being a C student. That just means that you're passing. That just means that you're average. I think that we as an industry could do a heck of a lot better than that. So should I request a pre-sub meeting? And if so, when? First of all, a pre-submission is not the same as a pre-submission meeting. This is one of many parts of this that people get confused about. The pre-submission is the entire process. That means preparing the submission, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. That means getting FDA's feedback. That means having a pre-sub meeting if you choose to have a meeting. And then that means following up by submitting your meeting notes and so on after the fact. So all of that is part of the pre-submission process. The pre-submission meeting is only that portion of the process that involves the meeting. So the pre-submission process is much broader than just the meeting itself. If we look at some more statistics, how many companies have actually had a meeting? This is what I find very interesting. Only about 53% of companies have had pre-submission meetings. A pre-submission meeting is not required. A pre-sub itself is not required. Whereas 45% of sponsors did not have a pre-submission meeting. I think that is, in most cases, a huge missed opportunity, Here's one more piece of general advice. Whenever I submit a pre-sub, I always request a meeting at the very beginning. Why? Because that way we can get it scheduled and on the books. And if for whatever reasons I change my mind and we decide not to have the meeting later, then fine, we can cancel it. But rarely ever do I cancel it. Even in those cases where FDA comes back and agrees with everything that I've proposed, that they say, Mike, we buy everything that you say, no problem. I still usually like to have a meeting. And again, we'll talk about some of the reasons why. So when would you not request a meeting? As I said a moment ago, virtually always I will request a meeting. If you're extremely confident in the key assumptions to bring your product onto the market, and three of the biggest for me are your regulatory strategy, for example, 510K, de novo, PMA, HDE, whatever, your testing matrix. This is a list of all of the tests that you're either have done already or planning to do to show that your product is safe and effective, to make sure that you can meet the label claims and so on, and your clinical data. If you think that you're not going to do a clinical trial, and the vast majority of medical devices, especially in the 510K world, do not involve clinical trials, I want to confirm that with the FDA. And if you are planning on doing a clinical trial, I want to get FDA's buy-in on what that trial will look like. In other words, the trial design, the inclusion and exclusion criteria, the endpoints, the pass-fail criteria, the power of the trial, the number of patients, the number of sites, and so on. Why? Because I see it happen fairly frequently where a company might do a clinical trial and FDA comes back and says, well, we want you to collect this, this one or two additional endpoints. And now the company has to do a clinical trial all over again in order to collect those additional pieces of information. It's amazing to me how often this happens, including to some of the largest medical device companies on earth who have dozens, if not hundreds of regulatory folks running around. And it makes me kind of, ask myself, what the heck, why the heck do these people have their jobs if they make such a boneheaded mistake? This is a very elementary school mistake. All of these things can be greatly mitigated, if not eliminated completely, by taking to your product into the FDA in advance in the form of a pre-submission meeting or perhaps some other method of communication. So what's a more important, a more important question than what is a pre-sub is why should we have a pre-sub? In other words, what are the risks and the benefits? Well, let's ask the question a slightly different way. Pardon me. What's the most common reason, or what an engineer would call the root cause of delays, of warning letters, of recalls, of 483s, of additional information requests? You name it. It's not communicating effectively. And notice I'm not saying not communicating. I'm saying not communicating effectively. It's amazing to me how many people assume that what I say, for example, is what somebody else hears. I don't know if any of you are married in the audience, but one thing I've learned in being married is just because I say one thing doesn't necessarily mean my wife hears the same thing. She might hear something completely differently. Well, a lot of people appreciate that, but what a lot of people don't seem to appreciate is the same thing happens between a company and the FDA. Just because the company is saying or writing one thing doesn't necessarily mean that the FDA is understanding or hearing the same thing. So communicating should not be your goal. Communicating effectively should be your goal. And that's another aspect of the pre-sub process. But back to the question of why is this so important? Well, what percent of submissions are kicked back after their first review? For those of you that work in the 510K world, this is the most current data on that. You see that a little more than 70% of 510Ks that are submitted to the FDA today are rejected first time out of the box. 70%, and this number has fluctuated plus or minus, about 10% for the last 20 years or so. So the question is this progress? And in the 510K world, when you look at those 70-odd% that are rejected, about 85% of them are rejected specifically because of substantial equivalence or the lack thereof. This should never, ever, 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 ever happen. Can I be any more clear than that? This should absolutely not happen. Once again, it's an amateur mistake. It's an elementary school mistake. It's a boneheaded mistake. This risk can be greatly mitigated, if not completely avoided, by taking your device to the FDA in advance of your submission, i.e. using a pre-sub to, among other things, talk about your regulatory strategy. If it's a 510K, here's the predicate that we're going to use. Here's the product code that we're going to use and all of the reasons why. Unfortunately, I've been playing this game now for about 30 years. Our industry has devolved to the point where we're basically treating the FDA as our elementary school teacher. In other words, here's my homework assignment. Will you please mark it up and give it back to me? And that is absolutely not the way this game is supposed to be played, at least not in my opinion. And, 30 years ago when I started playing this game, it was not played this way. But nowadays, for whatever reason, that seems to happen. For those of you that work in the Class 3 PMA universe, the statistics are even worse. Some within the last couple of years, between 75 and 95% of PMAs are rejected first time out of the box. 75 to 95% are rejected. They end up with what we call a major deficiency letter or an MDL. And again, look at the trends over the last 20 years or so for 510Ks and PMAs. The data is bouncing around a little bit, but it's roughly between 70, 80, 90%. So the question is this progress? I think not. In spite of all of the guidance that FDA has put out over the years and all of the other resources that I've put out and other people have put out over the years, our industry, quite frankly, is really not improving very much. I hate to say it, but I think that statistics that are on the screen right now bear that out. It's kind of Einstein's definition of insanity. If you keep doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result, we keep doing the same things over and over, and I have no idea why, but people think that they're going to better result, a different result. So what's my goal? My goal is not simply to get a submission accepted. Any monkey can do that, quite frankly. My goal is to get my submission accepted, ideally the first time out of the box, if possible. That is, with no additional questions, no additional information requests, no major deficiency letters, none of that. Or at the very least, with as few number of questions or kickbacks as possible. In other words, I work really hard to get all of the questions answered in advance of the submission, so that once the submission goes in, assuming that the data shows what we hope it's going to show, now it's just a matter of going through the system, everybody putting on their John Hancock, and we're done. As a matter of fact, I set the bar very high. I set the bar, any submission that comes back to me for whatever reason, if it's an AIR or anything else, any submission that comes back, I view that as a failure. 100% complete and utter failure. And based on the statistics that are on the screen right now, the vast majority of submissions that are sent to the FDA by that criteria are failure. So I don't want to be in the 70 to 90% of people that get additional questions and problems. I want to be in the 10 to 30% that do not. In other words, I'm very, very proud to be in that minority, not in the majority. What is the secret ingredient in my sauce that helps me achieve that? Well, I get lots of ingredients, but probably the single most important is communication with the agency in advance of the pre-sub, i.e. in the form of a pre-submission meeting or a pre-sub. I find this, back and forth kind of cat and mouse game where a company submits to the FDA, FDA comes back with some questions, you respond to their questions, they come back to you with some more questions. I think, quite frankly, this is nuts. And this is absolutely not the way this game is supposed to be played.
Hey,
Okay.
Mike, I'm sorry to interrupt. We just had a request. If you could click the hide button on there's like a little sharing screen prompt at the bottom of your screen.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that you were seeing that. Okay, is it gone now?
You. It's good. You're good. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. So here's another question. And by the way, some of these slides you'll see there's a little bonus question thing on there because this was not included in the agenda, but I've added a few additional things. What's the most common criticism of the pre-sub process? I've got a lot of criticisms of the pre-sub process. I pointed out some of the limitations a little bit earlier, but clearly the biggest criticism that I hear from industry all the time is that nothing FDA says is binding. As a matter of fact, for those of you that have had a pre-sub with the FDA, you probably remember 3, 4, maybe 5 times FDA will point out during our meeting, because this is part of the script, that nothing that they say is binding. Whenever they say that, I always say, thank you very much, FDA, for telling me something that I already know. But, oh, by the way, I want to remind you that street runs in 2 directions. In other words, nothing that I say is binding. So things can change, but nonetheless, it's still worth it, in my opinion, to have a pre-sub, even if things do change. And things don't change very often, but if FDA, for example, changes their mind after you do a pre-sub, because as I just said, nothing they say is binding. The first thing that I'm going to do is go back to the FDA with my meeting notes, and I'll say, hey, some months ago we had a pre-sub. This is what we agreed upon. You didn't raise any concerns, and now fast forward today, you seem to have changed your mind. What's going on? If FDA says, for example, well, we're aware of a problem with another product that's going on that we want to prevent from happening to you, I say, fair enough. That's fair game. That is FDA doing exactly their job, and that's what they should do. On the other hand, if they come back to me, and I've had this happen to me as well, they say, well, we're basically FDA. We can say or we can do whatever we want. I'm sorry, but that does not cut it with me. So even though things can change, even though nothing is binding, nothing that FDA says is binding, nothing that the company says is binding, that street runs in 2 directions. At the end of the day, I think of pre-submissions as cheap insurance. In other words, it's a great way to mitigate, if not eliminate, problems down the road. And some problems can be extremely time-consuming and expensive to fix, like, for example, having to repeat a clinical trial. Let me go back to the testing matrix example for a moment. I said that in most of my pre-subs, I include the testing matrix, which is a list of all of the tests that I plan to do to support my labeling, to show the device is safe and effective, and so on. The reason why I do that, and by the way, I don't justify the tests that I don't just justify the test that I'm doing. I also justify the test that I'm not doing. This is a very different approach that I take compared to other people. I don't justify what I'm doing, but I also justify what I'm not doing. Why? Because I want to give FDA every opportunity to disagree with me. In other words, I want to make it crystal clear that I know what I'm doing, that I am a medical device professional. But if you see it a different way, if you think there's a test out there that I should do that I'm not already planning on doing, then we need to talk about that, and we need to talk about that now. A lot of people make the mistake during the pre-sub process. They think that, well, if FDA doesn't bring something up during a pre-sub meeting, then there's no problem. There's nothing to be concerned about. I do not make that assumption. I want to make crystal clear what I'm doing as well as what I'm not doing. One of the most common reasons why submissions, I don't mean pre-submissions, but I mean actual submissions, 510Ks, PMAs, and so on. One of the most common reasons why submissions are rejected is because the company did X number of tests and the FDA comes back and says, we want you to do these, 1 or 2 or 3 additional tests. Once again, it's amazing how frequently that happens, but it's an absolutely amateur, if not boneheaded mistake. And again, some of you in this hypersensitive, politically correct society that we live in today, you might be thinking that I'm a bit harsh. Perhaps I am, but that's the way I see it. If we're going to call ourselves medical device professionals, that word professional should not be taken lightly. Are there other ways beyond the precept that we can communicate with the FDA? And if so, when and should they be used? Well, remember, as Shakespeare said, a rose by any name still smells sweet. The most important thing is that we communicate with the agency. How we do it, whether it's with a pre-sub or one of the other mechanisms I'll tell you about now, that's totally up to you. Quite frankly, I don't care. The important thing is that we actually communicate and communicate effectively. So how do we communicate with FDA? In terms of formal communications, we have pre-submission for medical devices that we can that we're talking about in this webinar. The sort of equivalent of that is the pre-IND meeting for drugs. We can do a 513G, a request for information. I'm not a big fan of the 513G for a bunch of reasons. For example, I said a moment ago, what FDA says in a pre-sub is not binding. What the company says in a pre-sub is not binding. Well, a 513G request, the results are supposed to be binding. In other words, the determination that FDA gives you, for example, we think that this is a class 2 device or something like that, that is supposed to or theoretically be binding. Why do I say theoretical? Because average regulatory professionals know the rules. The best regulatory professionals know the exceptions. I had a situation just about a year or a year and a half ago where we did a 513G request. The FDA came back and said, yes, this is the way it is. Then we subsequently did a pre-sub, and it turned out that FDA said, oh, we're sorry, but we changed our mind and we're no longer sticking with what we told you in the 513G before. I said, well, okay, thank you for telling me this, but what's your definition of binding? So things can change. So just, don't take a literal interpretation of the regulation. Take a logical interpretation. We can also do a request for designation or a RFD or a pre-RFD. If you're going to do if you're working on a combination product, that might be something that you might want to do. Informal ways of communicating with the agency. You can contact DICE, what used to be called the DISMICA, the Division of Industry and Consumer Education. You can ask them any question that you want. Although you don't ask them how to bring my medical device onto the market. That's not their job. That's your job. But a question that you might ask them is, hey, I've got this particular guidance in front of me. Can you confirm that this is the most current version of this guidance? Or is there another one out there that's more current? Or is there another one out there that's going to be released or something like that? That's a terrific question that you can ask DICE. Meet and greet has always been one of my favorites. We used to do this a lot more back in the day, not so much today because everything has become so formal. But by the way, a meet and greet is not the same as an informational pre-sub. And we talk about an informational pre-sub for just a second because there's several different types of pre-subs. One is an informational pre-sub. I am not a fan of informational pre-subs. As a matter of fact, I do not like informational pre-subs. I do not use them 99.999% of the time. Why? Because when FDA reviewers go to an informational pre-sub meeting, that's kind of like a student in a classroom listening to a lecture. They're not prepared to engage in a discussion. It's just like when you're in college and you go to a great big lecture with 400 or 500 of your closest friends. If I'm going to have a meeting with the FDA, I do not want to have a monologue. I do not want to give a lecture. I want to have a dialogue. I want to have a discussion. And because an informational pre-sub doesn't really allow me to do that or to do it as effectively as I can with other types of pre-subs, I usually do not use them. Occasionally, there might be some reason for it, but quite frankly, it's really not my primary job to educate the FDA, although I do have to spend some time educating the FDA, but it's really not my job. And last and certainly not least, you can contact them directly. You can email them, you can call them up on the telephone. It's amazing to me how many people don't do this. But remember, we're paying their salaries, both in terms of our US tax dollars as well as the user fees. So they work for us, meaning the industry. Most importantly, my mantra, for those of you that have heard any of my work before, you've heard me say this many, many times. Tell, don't ask, lead, don't follow. Please don't go to the FDA in a pre-sub meeting and ask, is my device a 510K or de novo? What kind of testing do I need to do on it? Do I need to do a clinical trial? That is terrible strategy for a whole bunch of reasons. First of all, it's not FDA's job to tell you what to do. It's your job to figure out what to do and then go to the FDA and sell it to them. And then the second reason why it's terrible strategy, in my opinion, is because you're opening up a Pandora's box and you have no idea what you're going to get. So for example, if you say, if you ask, do I need to do a clinical trial? What do you think FDA is going to say? Of course you need to do a clinical trial. And we want you to use, 50,000 patients or something like that. So on one hand, I'm a huge fan of communicating with the agency. There's nobody that will communicate with FDA more than I do. But on the other hand, remember my caveat, my mantra. Tell, don't ask, lead, don't follow. Walk into the FDA in your pre-sub and say very confidently, here's my device, this is what it does, here's how it works, here's its mechanism of action, and so on and so on. For all of the following reasons, we're bringing it onto the market as a 510K or a de novo or a PMA, or here's why. For all of the following reasons, here is the testing that we're going to do, and here's why, and here's the testing that we're not going to do, and here's why. And then for all of the following reasons, we're not going to do a clinical trial, and here's why, or we are going to do a clinical trial, and here's what it's going to look like, and so on and so on. And then, as my wife would say, you could stop talking now, right? You don't, we'll get to the pre-sub questions in a moment, but I want to confirm that FDA sees this the way I see it. If FDA says, that sounds great, Mike, we look forward to seeing your results in a few months, then terrific. But if they say, hold on, we don't quite see it that way, that's when the discussion, the debate begins. That's what I call the poker game, which we'll talk about in a moment. So can I send an email? Can I pick up the phone? Absolutely. It's amazing how few people do this. And here's one of my secret tips that I'll give you, even though in this public webinar. I'm a big fan of asking the lead reviewer, for example, for a very short what I call off the books or under the radar conversation, 10 minutes or less. Most people can fit something in 10 minutes or less without going through some formal process of scheduling and all of the bureaucracy and red tape that comes along with that. I don't have the patience for all of that. So if you have something that you want to discuss with the FDA that can be done in a short period of time, or even if it's just a check-in, even just to give an update, to say, you might remember 3 months ago, we came to you with our pre-sub, but we just wanted to give you a really, really quick update as to our progress because we're anticipating, making our submission next month. And we want to just let you know that it's coming. These are all things that you can do, but most people don't for whatever reasons. So my recommendations to companies: don't waste FDA's time or insult their intelligence by asking questions that you should know the answers to already. I see this happen all the time. Do your homework first, or if necessary, get some external help, whether it's somebody like me or somebody else to come in and help you through this process, as not just the regulatory, but the engineering and the biology and so on and so on. In other words, at the end of the day, you want to demonstrate to the FDA that you do know what the heck you're doing, that you'll certainly consider their suggestions and their advice, but at the end of the day, this is your party, this is not theirs. And similarly, on the FDA side of the table, please don't waste the company's time or insult their intelligence by providing generic advice. I see this all the time. FDA comes back with some very generic feedback like, well, follow the guidance document. Well, duh, gee, I hadn't thought about that before. Thank you for letting me know. Right. So if the company is not prepared, then FDA, you should tell them that they're not prepared. And you should tell them quite literally, don't waste our time. Come back to us when you have something to talk about. but do your homework. In other words, the suggestions that FDA's gives to the company should be very device specific. They should not be very generic, very general, like do biocompatibility testing or usability testing or whatever. That's not the purpose of having a pre-sub. A pre-sub is intended to talk about a specific device with a specific regulatory pathway and specific technology and so on and so on. All of that discussion should be focused like a laser on that specific device, not in generalities and platitudes. And how about individual accountability? Another thing that drives me nuts is when you submit meeting notes to the FDA, and we'll talk about the meeting notes in a little more in a few minutes. FDA prefers that you don't mention people's specific names. In other words, you're not supposed to say that John Smith, FDA reviewer, said XYZ. You're supposed to say FDA said XYZ. Well, why the heck not? When companies pay me for my advice, I put my name on it. As a matter of fact, as you see on the slide here, I put my picture on it. Why? Because I'm responsible for my device. If I tell somebody something that happens to be incorrect or wrong, then I should be responsible for it. It should work the same way at FDA. There should be individual accountability here. You shouldn't be able to just hide behind an organization, whether it's a company name or the FDA name. People should be individually accountable, just like a surgeon. A surgeon is held accountable for his or her own, actions. We should apply that same standard to us. In other words, we should all act like and be treated like medical device professionals. And please notice, I'm not using that word professional lightly. I hear a lot of people call themselves medical device professionals, but in my book, they are not acting like medical device professionals. Probably one of the most common questions that I ask get asked about the pre-sub process is, how early in the product development life cycle should we communicate with the FDA? And so usually the answer to this question I give is a bit schizophrenic. On one hand, I say, as early as possible, 1 nanosecond after you come up with the idea of your device is not too soon to go to the FDA with a pre-sub. But on the other hand, you should not go to the FDA with a pre-sub 1 day sooner than you're ready. In other words, what I mean by ready is you can not just present your device, what it does, how it works, but you can articulate your regulatory strategy and your testing matrix and your clinical data plan or whatever things that are appropriate in a logical, well thought out, well prepared way. Think about it this way. FDA's job is to be critical of everything. So in other words, I don't know where you all are located right now, but I'm here in Southern California, in San Diego. It's almost always a sunny day and the sky is blue. If I walk into the FDA and says the sky is blue, FDA's job is to say, okay, prove it. Let me say this one more time. If I walk into the FDA and say the sky is blue, FDA's job is to say, okay, prove it. They're not telling you, we don't think the sky is blue. All they're simply asking you is to prove that the sky is blue. The burden of proof is on you, the manufacturer, to prove that the sky is blue. It is not on the FDA to prove that the sky is not blue. That's the way this game is supposed to be played. And the pre-sub is a wonderful opportunity to do that. One challenge, though, I mentioned a moment ago, it's never too early to go to the FDA with a device, even if you just have a prototype, or in some cases, I've taken devices to the FDA as a pre-sub where we don't even have a prototype yet, where it's just a concept. That does present challenges because, let's be honest, most FDA reviewers are not used to seeing or thinking about or talking about products that are not yet at design freeze and at the point of final submission, where every single question should be able to be answered. When you go early in the product development process, there are many questions that you probably can't answer yet, but that's okay. I still want to have that dialogue, that engagement with the agency as early as possible. And I always preface it by saying our product is still under development. Therefore, our regulatory strategy is still under development. Our testing or clinical data plan is still under development. We might not be able to answer all of the questions, but nonetheless, we still want to have that dialogue to make sure that everybody is at least pulling in the same direction. Unfortunately, a lot of companies, the first time they contact the agency is with their final submission. I don't want to say that's a mistake, but that's not the way that I like to practice. I'm a huge fan, as I've said now a few times, of talking to the FDA prior to the actual submission. But remember my mantra: tell, don't ask, lead, don't follow. And if I haven't beat this into your head enough, because so many people, they just don't get this, something to think about. All right. How does the process, the pre-submission process work, and what can the manufacturer expect? In other words, what's required? Well, technically speaking, the process is quite simple. There's only 3 steps. You need to make the request. You need to submit your pre-submission package, is what I call it, that provides all the information. And at the end of that, you need to ask some questions, which, by the way, that third requirement of asking questions, I have such a huge problem with. We'll talk about this more in a few minutes, because I think it's very insulting, if not condescending, for FDA to require a manufacturer to go to them with questions. That automatically assumes that I, as the medical device manufacturer, are somehow subservient or less knowledgeable than the FDA is. And I do not make that assumption. I respect the FDA. There's nobody that has greater respect than I do. As one of my former FDA reviewer friends used to say, a physician can kill patients one at a time, but an FDA reviewer can kill patients thousands at a time. So I have a lot of respect for the FDA, but I do not worship them. And I think being required to ask them questions immediately puts me in a position of in a defensive position or a subservient position. And but I have a workaround that I'll share with you in a moment, because if you don't include questions, then your pre-sub request will be rejected. So going beyond what's in the guidance, this 3-phase process, what happens before the meeting? This is when you prepare the pre-sub package, and everything, as we'll talk about, everything that goes into your pre-sub package goes, every sentence, every word, every character, every punctuation mark should be put in there for one reason and one reason only. And that is to help FDA come to the answer to the question that you want them to come to. In other words, I talked about the questions a moment ago. I will, in the pre-sub guidance, FDA lists dozens and dozens and dozens of example questions. I will never in a million years use any of them. I think they are absolutely terrible questions for a variety of reasons. Instead, as my attorney friends like to say, I always phrase my question as a leading question. In other words, I want them to come to the answer that I want them to come to. And therefore, everything that goes into the package should be in there for one reason and one reason and only. And that is to help FDA come to the answer to the question that I want them to come to. Moving on to the next phase, what happens during the actual meeting, if you choose to have a meeting. Again, you don't have to, but I always do. You need to prepare for the presentation. My best advice there is keep it short, but not too short. For example, sometimes people, I tell customers, well, it's part of your presentation. And by the way, in a 60-minute meeting, I try to keep the formal presentation limited to about 15 to maybe 20 minutes at the max. And within the formal presentation, I will have a recap of the device description. And sometimes companies will ask me, Mike, well, we've already put the device description in the pre-sub package. Therefore, why are we wasting meeting time talking about it again? Well, I can understand why somebody asked that question, but let me just let you in on the realities of the real world. 2 things. First of all, you might be working on your device, say 24/7, but for an FDA reviewer, that your device is just one of dozens and dozens and dozens of devices that they're working on. And the other reason, let's be honest, is unfortunately there are those FDA reviewers that will not read your pre-submission package until literally they are walking into the room, or literally logging onto the Zoom if it's a remote call. I wish I could tell you that never happens. It does happen. So rather than being naive and think that these things don't happen, I will spend a bit of time, again, not a lot, recapping what the device does, how it works, its mechanism of action. I will recap the labeling, the intended use, the indications for use, and so on and so on. The most important part of the meeting, though, by far, is the negotiation. This is when you negotiate. This is when the poker game begins. For those of you that have listened to any of my podcasts or webinars before, I characterize the entire relationship between the company and the FDA as a poker game in every sense of the word. And just because somebody understands the rules of poker doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be a good poker player. It certainly doesn't mean that they're going to win the game. I want to do everything that I can in order, legal, of course. I don't want to be wearing any orange jumpsuits in order to win the game. In other words, two people can have exactly the same set of cards in their hands, and one will win and the other will lose. You can read 50 books on the rules of poker if you wanted to. Does that mean that you're going to be a good poker player? Does that mean that you're going to win the game? Absolutely not. It's all about the strategy. So taking this poker metaphor a step further in terms of pre-subs, when I walk into the FDA with a pre-sub, I have 3 stacks of cards in my hands. The first stack of cards are the cards that I put down prophylactically without anybody even asking. In other words, I'm not going to do a clinical trial, and here's why. A second set of cards that I will keep in my hand, and I will play them only if I need to. So for example, if FDA says, nice try, Mike, but there's not a snowball's chance in San Diego that you're going to get this product onto the market without any clinical data, then I will take one of the cards out of the second stack and say, you know what, in our professional opinion, we don't think that clinical data is necessary. However, we do acknowledge that some people might not see it that way. Therefore, we're willing to do a small clinical trial, and here's what it's going to look like. So that would be in the second set of cards. And then you might take that a step further. The FDA might say, gee, that's a start, but we want more clinical data. So you might have another card in your second stack that you play down that has a little more robust clinical trial design, like the higher statistical power or longer follow-up or something like that. And FDA will say, oh, that sounds terrific. No, we have a meeting of the minds, as the attorneys would like to say. You've got to be prepared to negotiate. That's one of the things that will make a successful pre-sub. I can't tell you how many times I've seen companies go into the FDA, they present their plan for whatever reasons FDA says they're not buying it, and the company doesn't know what to do. They're looking at the FDA like a deer in the headlights because they're not prepared to negotiate. I spend a lot of time prepping out scenarios. If FDA says this, we say that. If FDA asks this, we respond that, and so on and so on and so on. And then the third set of cards that I keep in my pocket, and those cards stay in my pocket forever. I cannot play them even if I wanted to. Like, for example, let's say that the technology does not exist to do a particular test, or let's say that the company doesn't have the resources to do a larger clinical trial or something like that. Those cards that I keep in my pocket that I never play because I can't. So when I say that this is a poker game, I mean that in every sense of the word. In order to have a successful pre-sub, you've really got to spend time negotiating. And one of the things that I do with my customers, it's not on a slide, maybe I should add it, is before going to the FDA with a pre-submission, or I do this with file submissions as well, the company will ask me to come in and put my FDA reviewer hat on temporarily and read their pre-sub package, sit through their pre-sub presentation, and if I can be a bit blunt here, bash the hell out of it. Because the idea is, if there's going to be a weakness or if the company's going to make a mistake, better for them to do it in front of me. After all, what do I count? I don't matter, than doing it at the FDA where it really does matter. Now, I don't want to go so far as to say that, if you can get past me, you can get past the FDA. But I will tell you, after 30 years of playing this game, I can play a pretty good surrogate for the FDA. So that's something that you might want to think about. If you're getting ready, for example, to go to the FDA with a pre-sub, before you do, give me a call and say, hey, Mike, why don't you take a look at our pre-sub and sit through our presentation and give us your 2 bits? I'd be very happy to do that. Contact me if you're interested. And then finally, phase 3, what happens after the meeting is over? Well, one of the requirements is the company needs to submit meeting notes. The company is responsible for writing the notes, not the FDA, which in my opinion is a huge advantage because you can control the spin. The FDA can always edit your meeting notes, but you have the first chance of writing them. And according to the guidance, you are required to submit them within 15 days of the meeting. Now, I notice that I'm putting the word required in air quotes because guidance is not regulation. Guidance is only suggestion. So how can FDA require anybody to do anything in something that is not regulation, that is only guidance. I'll leave that as a rhetorical question. But more importantly, I don't know where this 15-day business comes from. I think that's ridiculous. What difference does it make to FDA if you submit them within 5 days or 15 days or 100 days, or you never submit them up at all? That's up to the company. We don't need people micromanaging us, telling us that you need to give us your homework assignment by, next Tuesday. If you don't turn in your homework assignment, no problem, but then you're responsible. If you have a problem with your submission later on and you don't have documented in your meeting notes because you never submitted the meeting notes, that's your fault. That's not FDA's fault. So, having to do this within 15 days, I don't know. I think that's kind of nonsense. And if there's a disagreement or a dispute about the meeting notes or anything else that you've talked about in the meeting, this is an opportunity for you to address this with FDA as well. But as my wife would say, you have to pick your battles. Some things are worth fighting over, some things are not. Many times I have been in situations where FDA will ask for a particular test, a biocompatibility test, for example, and I happen to be a subject matter expert for FDA and biocompatibility. They'll ask for a particular biocomp test that I, as a professional biomedical engineer, think is not necessary. But if that test is something that we can do in a small amount of time for a small amount of money, I might say to the company, you know what, it's probably better for us just to do this biocomp test, even though it's not necessary, to just simply tick the box and move on to the next thing and keep our keep our political capital for something worthwhile fighting over later, like the size of a clinical trial or a more extensive biocompatibility test or something like that. Now, please don't miss my message here. I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't do certain testing or you should get away with the minimal testing as I can. On the contrary, I am absolutely not saying that. But what I'm saying is, if you're going to do testing, there needs to be justification for it. And in my opinion, just because the regulation says you need to do this test, that is not a justification. It's not a sufficient justification. The justification should be based on engineering or biology, or ideally or on both. So what goes into the pre-sub package? As I said before, every word, every punctuation mark should be put in there for one reason and one reason only, and that is to help FDA come to the answer to the question that you want them to come to. So here is, beyond the guidance, some of the suggestions of what you should put into your pre-sub package. Obviously, title page, cover letter, type of contents, your meeting objectives. I'll talk more about those in a moment. That's probably the most important part of the entire pre-sub process, is the meeting objectives and the pre-sub questions. A little bit about the overview, the device description. And this, in my opinion, is one of the most poorly written sections, not just of pre-submissions, but of final submissions. Why? Because the vast majority of questions that I see coming back from reviewers is simply indicative of the fact that they do not understand the device, what it does, how it works, its MOA, and so on and so on. Therefore, I point to the device description to be the root cause of that problem. In other words, the responsibility is the company's to make sure that the FDA understands how their device works. The responsibility is not on the FDA to find out from the company. So because so many questions come back because the reviewers don't understand the device, remember what I said earlier, just because you're saying or writing one thing doesn't necessarily mean FDA is hearing the same thing. Pay particular close attention to your device description. I'll give you a quick example. Measure the efficacy of your device description. We're all used to measuring efficacy of our devices, but not of our regulatory communications like the device description. So how do you do that? Take your device description, put it into the hands of somebody who's not familiar with your device, ask them to read it, and then ask them to summarize what they just read. And if they describe to you, if they paint a picture to you of what your device does and how it works, then terrific, that's great, you're communicating. But if they are so confused that they can't paint that picture, or worse, if they paint a picture that is drastically different than the device that you're developing, now you know you're not communicating. This is just such basic stuff, but to me it's amazing how few people do this. Do we need regulation to require these things? I don't know, perhaps, but I would like to think not. Any previous discussions, your product development and your testing strategy, as I've said before, don't justify what you're doing, but also justify what you're not doing and why you're not doing it. Very, very few people coming into the FDA justify what they're not doing. But remember, they're in that majority of 70 to 90% of submissions that are rejected first time out of the box. I want to be the minority of people, that 10 to 30% that are not rejected first time out of the box. And what I'm sharing with you today are some, not all, but some of the ingredients that go into that secret sauce. Your regulatory strategy, obviously, summaries, your pre-sub questions, and as we'll talk about, the pre-sub questions are exactly the same as the meeting objectives in my book. Only one is phrased in the form of a statement, the other is phrased in the form of a question. But other than that, they are the same. They are substantially equivalent. Method of feedback and references, lit review, whatever else is necessary. The content in the organization is totally up to you, not up to the FDA. One of the big advantages of the pre-sub, unlike a final submission, is that it is 100% up to the company what to talk about. You tell the FDA what you want to talk about. You tell the FDA what you don't want to talk about. The content in the organization is totally up to you. Bottom line, at the end of the day, you need to give FDA enough information to be able, about your device, what it does, how it works, your regulatory strategy, all those things, in order to sit down and have an intelligent conversation. Because if you don't give them that background, so to speak, then what's the point of engaging in this dialogue? It's a total waste of time. So you need to give enough information to have an intelligent conversation, but the breadth of information, in other words, how many topics you include, and the depth of the information, how much detail that you go into, that is totally up to you. And again, if you're not sure about this, if you haven't done this before, or even if you have done this before, and you want a little cheap insurance, ask me or somebody else to come in and do sort of an independent assessment. And this is for those of you that are familiar with the design controls. What I'm describing here is the concept of the independent reviewer. I don't mean the independent reviewer in the design sense of the word. In this particular context, I mean independent reviewer in the regulatory sense of the word. I think this is another thing that more companies should do that quite frankly, most of them do not. So I hinted a little bit about the pre-sub questions and the objectives as being the most important part of the pre-sub. That is absolutely the case. What's my advice? My advice, as Stephen Covey said, begin with the end in mind. In other words, what at the end of the pre-sub process, what do you want to walk out of the room having an agreement on? Having an agreement on your biocompatibility testing, your usability testing, your animal testing, your clinical data plan, whatever it is. What do you want to have walking out the door at the end of the meeting? And then craft your questions and objectives to meet those goals. As Stephen Covey said, begin with the end in mind. Whenever I start working on a pre-sub, the very first thing I work on with the company is the pre-sub objectives and questions. Why? Because once again, as I've said now a couple of times, every single word, every single punctuation mark that goes into the pre-sub should be put in there for one reason: to meet those objectives and to answer those leading questions. That's the first part. The pre-sub objectives are substantially equivalent, pun intended, to the pre-sub questions, but they're just phrased in different ways. So in other words, your objective is phrased in the form of a statement, and your questions are phrased in the form of a question. I'll show you an example. Actually, I'll show you an example right now. I have some templates that I've developed that I share with my customers. I'm not going to make this available as part of the webinar, but I'll just show you a quick example of, for example, a 510K question. Confirmation that based on the device's name and the technology, the company has demonstrated that the 510K is the appropriate regulatory pathway to make to market, and a class 2 is the appropriate classification for the subject device. Further, confirmation that the company has demonstrated that the predicate is the appropriate predicate, both in terms of labeling and technology, and the product code is the appropriate product code. Now, notice I'm doing several things here. A little while ago, I said I despise the questions that are in the example questions that are in the guidance, because I think they're terrible questions. And one of the many reasons that a lot of people start their pre-sub questions, does FDA agree, ... I hate that. I mean, quite frankly, that is so condescending. Quite frankly, I don't care if FDA agrees with me or not. I mean, yeah, I would like them to agree with me, but that's not my job. My job is, have I demonstrated that let me go to the to the question version of this same thing. It's further down in this document. Notice how it starts here. Based on the device's labeling and technology, has the company demonstrated that the 510K is the appropriate regulatory pathway? There's a big difference. And one other thing that I want to point out and justify what I'm doing as well as what I'm not doing. Look at the de novo example. Here's a question that I use in most of my de novo precepts. Based on the device's name and technology, has the company demonstrated that the de novo is the appropriate regulatory pathway, class 2 classification, and so on? Further, has the company demonstrated that the 510K is not the appropriate pathway to market, as there's no suitable predicate or product code? Here is an example of how I'm justifying what I'm not doing and why I'm not doing this. Now, a lot of companies don't like to do this because they'll think, especially if I do it the opposite, if I say that I'm doing this as a 510K and not a de novo, that's going to put into FDA's mind that maybe they should be, thinking about a de novo here. I don't look at it that way. I think that it's important to justify not just what you're doing, but what you're not doing and why. Once again, because I know I'm going to get emails on this, I showed you a couple of excerpts from that particular template. I've got a pre-sub template as well, but I don't provide that level of detail in the webinar. If you have specific questions, feel free to contact me. As I said before, one of the requirements is to ask questions of the FDA, but in my not so humble opinion, that's very, very condescending, to put it politely. So my best advice is, if we have to ask a question, and we do, because it's not going to get accepted if you don't, the way you play this game and win the game is by asking a leading question. As I said before, I would never use any of the questions that are in the guidance. This is not a criticism of FDA, because they're playing, this on the other side of the table. I'm talking about, how do you win the game? And recently, maybe as some of you have heard, FDA is now trying to limit the number of questions that go into a pre-sub. For a variety of reasons, I think that's the totally wrong approach. I had one pre-sub go in that had one question and 64 parts. So limiting the number of questions is totally the wrong approach. In my opinion, the better thing to do is to limit the time. You say to the company, okay, a pre-sub meeting is 60 minutes. Actually, in reality, it's a little less than 60 minutes, but approximately 60 minutes. You can use that time however you want. If you want to talk about 65 different things within that 1 hour, fine, no problem. If you want to talk about one thing in much more depth in 1 hour, fine, no problem. I don't need my FDA friends micromanaging me, telling me, how many questions I can ask. That's nuts. It should be up to me as the medical device professional to do that. So I just think that that's going in the wrong direction. Some of you might disagree. If you do, feel free to chime in the Q&A section that we're going to get to in just a couple more minutes. Is there a pre-sub template? And if so, how should I use it? Well, there are a few choices. One choice is the pre-sub guidance, which you can refer to specifically on pages 13 and 14. They have some suggestions on the sections. I shared with you my suggestions on the sections before, but in my opinion, what's in the guidance is not nearly enough. It's very, very, very high level, very generic. So I would refer to that list of sections that I provided in one of the previous slides. There is within the eStar program now a pre-star specifically for pre-subs. I don't have time to talk about that in detail, but in my opinion, the pre-star is still very, very limited. I've used it a couple of times now, but I'm not a big fan. You can certainly design your own pre-sub template, and that's what I've done, because over the years I've developed my own template. And here's just a quick peek at that. It has all of the different sections. I'm just going to, the cover letter, the device description, the background of the company, the meeting objectives, and so on and so on. Because I just don't think that what's in the guidance is enough. And by the way, not to brag, but several of the suggestions that FDA has put into the multiple pre-sub guidances over the years have come from me, because I've been using essentially my same template for probably close to 20 years. What information should I provide in the pre-sub, and what should be provided during the meeting? Well, you want to tell a story. And one of the things that I like to do at the beginning of a pre-sub is I want to put a clinical face on the problem, literally. In other words, before I start talking about my device, what it does, how it works, the regulatory strategy, the testing, and so on, I will literally put a picture of a patient on the screen. And I will say, meet Mary Smith. Before using our medical device, Mary Smith was not able to do X, Y, and Z. Now, as a result of using our medical device, she is able to do X, Y, and Z. Some people say, well, Mike, you're really pulling on people's emotional purse strings. Yes, that's exactly what I'm doing. But what I am also doing is I'm reminding them that at the end of the day, this is much more important than following regulations and doing certain tests and so on. We're talking about people's lives. And if I can capture the audience at the beginning by putting a clinical face on the problem, for any of you that have done presentations before, you know that capturing the audience from the beginning is the most important part. If you don't capture them, I don't care what you're talking about. It's a total and complete and utter waste of time. As I said before, you want to spend a little bit of time reiterating the device description. You want to spend a little bit of time reiterating the labeling, specifically the high-level labeling, the intended use and the indications for use. You want to recap FDA's feedback. In other words, we asked this question, FDA responded, here's our response. And then one of the other good things about a pre-sub is it gives you an opportunity to ask clarifying questions. So you say, in your response, FDA said, X, Y, Z. Can you clarify what you meant by that? Or can you give us an example? Or can you provide a justification as why you're making that recommendation, and so on and so on. But remember the time limit. You need to triage your topics that you want to talk about. I've seen it happen where, 50 or 55 minutes into a 1 hour meeting, the company is still on objective number 2. So you really want to have a strong moderator, a strong facilitator. Maybe it's me, maybe it's somebody else that can keep things moving along and not let you spend too much time on one topic unless it's warranted. And then the fun part begins, the discussion, the debate, the argument. Remember, as I said before, this is a poker game. You need to prepare to negotiate. You want to then end by summarizing what was agreed upon and what was not. And then, of course, at the end, you want to say, thank you for your suggestions, even if you don't mean it. Let's be honest, sometimes we don't always appreciate what FDA has to say, but you should respect what FDA has to say. But most important, as I said, manage your time. You got that 1 hour. You can use that however you want. It's your job to figure out how to use it in the most effective way. Remember, likely you in a company are working on one device every single day, but FDA reviewers may be working on dozens of devices, perhaps even more, all at the same time. What happens after the meeting, and I'm going to wrap this up in just a couple more minutes. Well, as I said before, you need to submit your meeting minutes. There's some information and even a sample format in the guidance on meeting minutes, although if you really need a template for meeting minutes, maybe you should go back to junior high school, I don't know. Who writes the meeting minutes? That's the company that writes them. Should they be required, and should they be required within 15 days? In my opinion, no, because it's not to the benefit of the FDA. It's not, at least not directly, it's the benefit of the company. So it's kind of like, an elementary school kid, getting assigned a homework and not turning it in, right? If you don't turn it in, it's your fault. It's not the teacher's fault. Most importantly, the meeting minutes are not a script. In other words, it's not supposed to be a transcript of he said, she said, he said. It should be a summary, and write them strategically. In other words, document what was said, but also document what was not said. If I ask FDA a question 3 or 4 times and nobody says anything, I will document that. Why? Because later down in the process, if that becomes an issue, I will pull out the meeting minutes and I will say, look, we had this pre-sub meeting. Yes, it's not binding, but we have in our notes here that we asked this question several times and nobody said anything. Why are you saying something now? At least it's a point to put a stake in the ground, to have a discussion, a dialogue. These are strategic documents, and that's the way they should be written. Are these results binding? As we said, yes and no. It depends on what your definition of binding is. What's most important about the meeting minutes and about this whole process in general is building and maintaining a relationship with the various FDA reviewers and subject matter experts, and especially with the lead reviewer. I find it very frustrating when I hear my friends like Jeff Shorin and others, the top people at FDA say, well, it doesn't matter what reviewer you get because everybody's following the same rules the same way. Well, with all due respect, bull, you know what? I can give the same text to 10 different people and get 10 drastically different interpretations. So why should I assume that everybody's following all the same rules the same ways? One of the cool things about my job is I work in pretty much all areas of medical devices. And so I deal with all of the different divisions within CDRH. And let me tell you, they are not always consistent with one another. What happens in one division might be very different than what happens in another, even though the rules are supposed to be the same. How long does the process take? Remember, there are 3 phases: the pre-sub phase, which is under the company's control, and then the pre-sub phase itself. Here's some interesting statistics for you. The average number of FDA's days to receive the written feedback is about 60 days. That's pretty typical. Average days to schedule a meeting, about 40 days. And the percent of submissions with meetings for which the industry provides meeting notes, about 80%. So that means that 20% of companies are not submitting meeting notes, even though they are quote unquote required in the guidance. I find that kind of interesting. Take it for what it's worth. And then finally, the post pre-sub phase, where you might be working on your next pre-sub, you might be working on a pre-sub supplement, you might be working on your clearance or approval. And another thing that you should understand about pre-subs is the opportunity to do a pre-sub supplement. A pre-sub supplement is nothing more than, pardon me, a little kind of a focused pre-sub where you can go back to the FDA with additional information. The only caveat to submitting a pre-sub supplement, pardon me, is that the topic has to be addressed in the original pre-sub. It has to be addressed in the original pre-sub. So if you don't talk about usability testing in your original pre-sub, you cannot go to the FDA with a pre-sub supplement on usability testing. However, nowhere in the guidance or regulation does it say anything about the level of detail in that pre-sub description. So if I simply mention that I'm planning on doing usability testing, details TBD, and don't say anything else, then that allows me technically to go back to the FDA later with a pre-sub supplement with nauseating detail on usability testing or biocomp or electrical safety or whatever it is, as long as you mention it in there. So in many cases, I will advise a company to mention things in there, even if they're not prepared to talk about them in detail right now, to mention them in there. Why? In order to preserve your opportunity to go back to the FDA with a pre-sub supplement, as opposed to going back to the FDA with a whole brand new pre-sub. There are advantages and disadvantages to both, but remember, I'm not interested in just telling you the rules of the game. You can get that from the FDA webinars. I'm trying to teach you the strategies on how to win the game. Here are some breaking news from just 2 weeks ago from RAPS, or is it really new? Industry is asking FDA to provide more details on how informal communication can be used, expand the use of pre-sub templates, shorten key timelines, and so on and so on. There's nothing new here. People have been wanting this for a long time, but at the moment, there's no user fee for a pre-sub. Although give Congress a little more time, I'm sure they'll add one. But I'm not necessarily an advocate of adding a user fee to a pre-sub unless we do it in a very special way. In other words, I want to reward people for good behavior, and I want to penalize people for bad behavior. So for example, in my suggestion, and I made this suggestion maybe before, impose a pre-sub fee, but if the company has the pre-sub and the submission ultimately goes through with few, if any, questions or problems, give them their fee back. So they're rewarded for doing a job. Good job. On the other hand, if a company does not do a pre-sub and they submit a submission that looks like crap, and believe me, I have read submissions coming into the agency that are painful to read. They're painful to read. It's like, do they teach basic grammar in elementary school anymore? I don't know. Then penalize the company by imposing, hey, you did not have a pre-sub. We could have helped you discuss these issues a long time ago. Therefore, now we're making your fee for your 510K higher than what it would be. In other words, we want to use these to encourage good behavior and discourage bad behavior, not simply implement them across the board. What's the average time or approval with or without a pre-sub? This is a common question that I get from people. Unfortunately, there are no publicly available statistics on this, although I think there should be. FDA should, as part of the MNUFA reporting requirements, record in some way the average clearance or approval times for companies that have had pre-subs versus have not. I could come up with the average times based on my own company customers' experience, but obviously that's going to be biased. And I would like to think that my statistics are going to be much better than other people's statistics, but I would like to see what these statistics were across the board. Is a pre-sub required? Usually a pre-sub is not required, at least not in the medical device world, although as some of you know, this is very, very different for drugs and biologics. You do need to do in the drug world, in the biologic world, what we call a pre-IND. That is required, but sometimes it's required in the device world as well. So for example, if you're working on a class 3 device, a PMA or an HDE device, or even a class 2 device that's significant risk, meaning that it is not IDE exempt, then you will be required to do an IDE, and you will most likely be required to have a pre-IDE meeting. A pre-IDE meeting is essentially like a pre-sub, although the emphasis is obviously on the clinical aspect, not necessarily the others. So in some aspects, these are pre-subs are required in the medical device world. Remember what I said before, average regulatory professionals know the rules. The best ones know the exceptions. Should a pre-sub for devices be required? Well, that's an interesting question. I personally think there's a lot of advantages to doing them. There are some disadvantages as well. But like I said, in my practice, nearly 100% of the time, I would say 98, maybe 99% of the time, I usually recommend a pre-sub. And what about pre-subs for combination products? Now we're going to take this up a notch. And by the way, this was just published by RAPS a couple of days ago when we're doing this recording today. Can a manufacturer submit a pre-sub for a combination product? Well, the short answer to every question in regulatory affairs is it depends. What does it depend on? It depends on its primary mode of action, or PMOA. For those of you that are not familiar with PMOA, listen to my combination products webinar that I did for Greenlight, I think a year or so ago. I go into this in a lot of detail. But suffice it to say, if the PMOA of your combination product is device, then yes, you can submit a pre-sub to CDRH. On the other hand, if your PMOA is not device, let's say it's a prefilled syringe or a transdermal patch or something, those are primarily drugs, not devices. Therefore, you cannot submit a pre-sub to CDRH. Some people have asked, well, what if you do it anyway? Well, it's going to get thrown right back at you. It's going to be right back in your face. And FDA is going to say, this needs to go to CDER or CBER, or at the very least, they're going to say, this needs to go to the OCP, Office of Combination Products, for a jurisdictional consult to see if this is, in fact, primarily a device or not. So make sure, because I've seen this happen many times, that companies waste a ton of time and money assuming that their combo product is a device. They put together a pre-sub, they send it to CDRH, and FDA throws it right back at them and say, don't waste our time. If you're not sure what the PMOA of your combination product is, definitely find out. Talk to somebody like me. I've been working in combination products now for more than 20 years, long before FDA even recognized combination products as combination products. You might want to consider the pre-request for designation or the request for designation or something to get that determination. Even though this was published just literally a couple of days ago here, is there anything new here? Absolutely not. I mentioned the pre-sub meeting notes in your handout. You have my suggestions here beyond the guidance of the meeting notes. So I think I'm going to skip that. What's the cost of a pre-sub? Nothing yet, but as I said, give Congress a bit of time. They'll probably add one. I think for the sake of time, I had some extra questions that I was going to throw in because we're coming in close to the end, and I want to allow at least a little bit of time for Q&A. Let me just jump to the last couple of slides. Let's start with this one. Actually, I'm going to go to this one. So to wrap this up, and then Laura will start some Q&A so you can take a look and see which ones you want to discuss. To wrap this up, not just with regard to pre-subs in particular, but communications in general with the agency. If you get questions back on a submission, you are not communicating. If you get an AIR, an additional information request, or a major deficiency letter, you're not communicating. If you get a not substantially equivalent determination or an MDL, you're not communicating. If you get a 483 observation or a warning letter, you're not communicating. And last and certainly not least, if you're playing this ridiculous back and forth ping pong with FDA, you submit something to them, they send them back to you, you respond to them, blah, 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 which is a total and utter and complete waste of time, in my opinion. You're not communicating. It's that simple, or is it? With that, I'm going to jump to the end, and I want to thank everybody for your participation. If I want to thank my friends at Greenlight for the opportunity to conduct this webinar today. I'm happy to spend a few more minutes with some Q&A. If you don't have any questions at the moment, or if you're not able to ask them now, feel free to contact me directly. You have my phone and email and so on. I'm happy to help however I can. But Laura, at this point, why don't we open up the remaining time to Q&A, and hopefully we'll have some good dialogue.
Absolutely. So I'm going to go on a popularity approach on the number of likes these questions have gotten. So by far the most popular question here is, we have been asked to take all names out of our FDA minute notes and are recently being pressured to have them at such a high level that it misses the details of the conversation. Is this worth challenging, or will it sour the relationship they've built with their review team?
Excellent question. And I already shared a little bit about my opinion on it in terms of individual accountability. When FDA says take the names off, I'll respond to them, by saying, hey, if you're going to have surgery, would you like to know the name of the surgeon that's going to be operating on you? Now, whether you want to ask FDA that kind of a question or not, that's up to you, but I certainly would, because I think it makes the point. The more important thing that in that question was the level of detail, because what was the latter part of the question, Laura? Not about the names, but about the high level. Can you just read that portion of it again, please?
Yep. So they're being pressured to have the notes at such a high level that it misses the details of the conversation.
Yeah. So that's the most important part. If, according to the people that are asking this question, if you're missing the details of the conversation, and if those details are important, I'm assuming that they're important because you want to include them, then that's where I would push back. And that's where I would say, look, with all due respect, we're the ones that are responsible for writing the meeting notes. We're the ones that determine what goes into them. If you disagree with what was discussed, okay, that's fair enough. We can talk about it. But I would strongly push back, especially if the nature of those details could impact, something further down the road, like the final submission. Because if you're working on, say, a class 3 product where the timelines are very long, it might be many, many months, maybe even several years between the time that you do the pre-sub and the time that you make the final submission. Why would you assume that somebody at FDA is going to remember those details of the conversation? Or further, why would you assume that the same people are going to be involved? There's turnover at FDA, just like there's turnover in companies. So to that last point, Laura, what I would say to those folks is, if you think those details are important, then I would definitely push for them. That is something that I think would be a battle worth fighting, or maybe as a compromise, a certain level of detail. And by the way, one other suggestion: ask FDA before you push back. Ask FDA, why do you think these details should not be incorporated in the meeting notes? Why do you think the details should not be incorporated? In other words, if they say, well, we're trying to keep the meeting notes to 2 pages or less, for example, that's a bunch of crap. But if they give you some legitimate reason why, then you can talk about that. But in the absence of a legitimate reason, I would push back on that. Does that make sense, Laura?
Yep, I think so. So going to the next, I think we have a little bit of time for the next question.
Okay.
And then we'll make sure to share these questions with Mike as well. But what's the advantage of a pre-sub supplement versus a new submission?
Great question. I mentioned pre-sub supplements a little bit earlier. Just to reiterate, a pre-sub supplement gives you the opportunity to go to the FDA with additional information about one of the topics that you at least mentioned in your original pre-sub. The reason why a pre-sub supplement can be an advantage is because in some cases, not in all, but in some cases, it's a little quicker to go to the FDA with a pre-sub supplement. For those of you that are familiar with the BDP program, one of the advantages that companies get that get a BDP designation is, in addition to pre-subs, they can have what's called a sprint discussion. A pre-sub supplement is a little bit like a sprint discussion. It's a very focused, like a ledger. We want to talk only about usability or only about whatever, and therefore it can probably go through the system a little bit faster. But I have a situation right now where the company wants to go back to the FDA with pre-sub supplements on 2 or 3 different topics, because certain divisions within CDRH will allow overlapping pre-subs and others will not. Find out from that division if you can have overlapping pre-subs or overlapping pre-sub supplements. If you can, then great. If you cannot, then in my particular customer's case, what we've done is, even though the 3 topics that we want to talk further about were in the original pre-sub, we're not submitting them as pre-sub supplements because they would have to be submitted sequentially in series rather than parallel. Whereas if I take those 3 supplements and sandwich them into one overall pre-sub, now I can talk about all 3 in parallel to one another. So that's a quick sort of description of the pre-sub supplement and when you might want to use one versus the other.
Awesome. So we're out of time. I just want to thank you, Mike, for joining us today and providing such a really great informative session. I also want to thank everybody for joining us today. On behalf of Greenlight Guru, we thank you all. And we will be sending out the slides and information afterwards. That'll include this information where you can contact Mike if you have any additional questions. All right. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.